Well, I'm going to take the opportunity to introduce myself, and then we'll get started. I'm Patrice Kunesh. I'm the director of the Center for Indian Country Development here at the Minneapolis Fed. I'd like to welcome all of you tonight, and thank you for coming out on this kind of cold, dreary night, but I hope we're going to have a really good conversation. I'm mindful, first of all, that we are situated and gathered on native lands. So I just want to take a moment to recognize and appreciate that we are here on the historic Dakota and Anishinaabe people's lands. And so also let me greet you in the language of my own Lakota relatives, Shande Washtea Timehiyo, which means come in with a good heart. And I hope as we have our conversation tonight, our hearts will open further and really have a good sense and appreciation for the work and the history of our American Indian communities. I'd like to also take a moment to introduce the staff of the Center for Indian Country Development. We have Donna Fair, our research economist. We have Nikki Paradas, and she oversees our home ownership work, primarily our Native Home Ownership Coalition work. Jessie Welton, she's an operations manager, probably running around doing something very important. She's also getting a deep dive into education. I have to say that Dick Todd, our beloved advisor and economist, is retiring soon and isn't with us tonight, but he's certainly here with us in spirit. My colleague, Michael Grover. Michael, where are you? He is the director of our community development department, and the rest of the CD team really support us in a good way. The newest member of our staff is Aline Churamoff. She is the senior vice president for community development and engagement. I just really want to appreciate all of our other Fed folks, public affairs, just tremendous supporters of our work. I also need to say that all comments and opinions that I'm expressing tonight are my own and not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve System or the Minneapolis Fed. So let's get started. I think tonight I'd like to talk about three different areas, and they might blend together at some point or time, but I thought I would just sort of situate us in the Federal Reserve System. Where are we, the Minneapolis Fed, in the entire system? And then I thought I should let you know how the CICD came to be as a center of research at the Minneapolis Fed. And then I'd like to take you through a journey of our research and the relationships that we've crafted in order to do this work. So many of you may have heard about the dual mandate of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve has several core responsibilities in addition to the mandate, and the community development function is where we fit in. So when we talk about the dual mandate, we're talking about, first, the mandate to maintain low inflation rate, and that would be at a rate of about 2%. We want to keep inflation low. And our other mandate is to promote maximum employment, and therein lies the tension. Of course, the Fed also regulates banks, including fair lending, and we promote the integrity of the U.S. payment system, an enormously important part of our work and responsibility. The Fed also has important research responsibilities, and that research really goes into deeply the workings of our economy to help set economic policies and examine barriers to economic growth and stability. A few years ago, the Minneapolis Fed created the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute here. And it's headed now by Abby Wozniak, and its purpose is to conduct research that increases economic opportunity and help the Federal Reserve achieve its maximum employment mandate. So anything that's a drag on the economy, any disproportionate overrepresentation, especially when we see economic inequality gaps that we are these days. This is really where we see the OIGI focusing their work and attention. So all of these responsibilities are really common to central banks around the world. But the U.S. central bank has a different or a unique structure. Rather than concentrating all the power in Washington, D.C. with our Board of Governors, Congress dispersed that authority and created 12 independent, distinct Federal Reserve banks throughout the country. It really wanted to ensure that the many varying local conditions, those that are happening in rural America, are also captured in the economic policy making and decision making. So the Minneapolis Fed is the 9th district, and we encompass territory from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan all the way out to the western borders of Montana. It's a very, very large land base. The Fed also promotes investments in underserved communities. That comes really through the Community Reinvestment Act responsibilities. That law was passed in 1978 as really sort of a check and balance, a form of regulation to ensure that banks are serving those who need financial services in their assessment areas. And certainly one of these areas, especially in the 9th district, is Indian country. So here at the Minneapolis Fed, Community Development Department has had a very long history of working in Indian country. We have 45 federally recognized Indian tribes, significant populations in all of these states, and as I said earlier, a tremendous land base. So for example, the Community Development Department has helped in particular with our Indian business alliances, have worked to support private economies through the Model Tribal Secure Transaction Act. And so that work is still continuing and really forms sort of the basis of where we got to be with the Center for Indian Country Development. Now I thought I'd show you a map of Indian country. The center operates on a national level, well beyond the 9th district. And as I mentioned, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan all the way out to Montana, 45 tribes, or fairly recognized tribes. But we see across the country the whole spectrum of tribes from Maine to Florida, from Alaska and Washington to California, which has over 100 tribes, and many in between. Now we see some very large land bases. Those are reservations. And the blue right there in the middle, that's Oklahoma, the original Indian Territory. Now they may not have well-defined reservations. You have a few reservations left, but most of those we call statistical areas. So obviously a very large, significant Native American population in those communities. Now on the side, we see the little tiny state of Hawaii, and we don't consider that Indian country from a legal perspective, from a federal definitional perspective, but we do include Native Hawaiians in our encompassing of indigenous Native people. So 573 tribes, 6 recently recognized tribes from the state of Virginia that exercise territorial jurisdiction. They are sovereigns, they are nations unto themselves. They occupy lands that are held in trust by the federal government. That means that the federal government owns these lands and American Indian people have the right to use those lands. And a big part of my comments and conversation tonight is going to be the difficulty and the challenges we have to unlock the potentials of those lands. So we contrast those trust lands with probably what you're most familiar with, fee lands that are able to be bought and sold and encumbered and alienable in a very ordinary course of business. So a significant challenge to meaningful economic development is unlocking this value of the trust lands. And it's probably one of the most significant pieces of work that we're trying to do in the Center for Indian Country Development. So we have about 5.2 million American Indians and Alaska Natives. That's how the US Census defines this category. Now I have to say that typically people think of this as a race or ethnicity. It's really a political status between the citizen and the nation, and that's because of the political relationship between that native nation and the federal government. So we have 5.2 million American Indians and Alaska Natives, and collectively we make up about 2% of the US population. And here in Minnesota, it's a little bit more than 1%. Of course, Minnesota has a very significant urban Indian population here in the Twin Cities, Duluth, Bemidji, and so forth. The population is often not reported in mainstream demographic or economic data, but rather it is signified by an asterisk, or we're lumped in this other category. And that's a real problem. I should say that the small population is not an accident. Native populations were ravaged not only by accidental diseases, but by explicit violence, war, and violations of agreements, treaties that promised to provide food, safe housing, and certainly access to lands for subsistence rights. Tribes were also segregated into reservations and stripped of their ability to govern and provide for themselves for a very substantial period of time. So this economic marginalization to begin with, to really situate ourselves in this space, is to really recognize the vulnerability as a race of inheriting these traumatic incidences that lead to disease and death. Indeed, more often than not, the American Indian population appears as a grossly overrepresented population in the spectrum of negative socioeconomic factors. We hear about the poverty and the low attainment in education and the poor health outcomes, high mortality. So paying attention to this population, despite its size, I think is an issue of both economic and historic justice. So let me tell you a little bit more about the Center for Indian Country Development. It was established in 2015. I was in Washington, D.C., and I was hired to do this job, and I came back to Minnesota. I actually grew up in Minnesota, but I'd been away for 35 years. So I came back to take this job, and I really was curious about what tools and resources do we have, because we're really not a bank and we don't lend money. We have really great resources such as research, so I decided that that would be the tool that we use to delve into these issues. And we really are focused on research that helps us better understand the real and the lived experience that's often overlooked in this segment of our economy. So why Indian country? Narayana Kocherlakota, who was a previous president, had a very strong tie to Indian country, and he was actually one of the leaders of the opportunity to create the center. And he recognized that Indian country is a distinctly important component of the U.S. economy. For example, I'm sure you didn't know that tribes comprise the 13th largest employer in the United States. That's pretty amazing to think about the tribes, this small population, these native nations, being the 13th largest employer in the United States. Indeed, they employ over 700,000 employees. Now, many of these employees may be non-Indians, but think about the jobs and the benefits and the wages that are being paid by these operations. So tribes definitely are making significant contributions to the regional and local economies, and we call this the spillover effect. Not all tribes are well off, most definitely. The American Indian and Alaska Native population presents some of the most severe socioeconomic statistics, as I mentioned earlier. Many tribes lack an adequate and independent revenue source to support their communities. That opportunity has really been either blocked or locked up, or it's never been able to be fully expressed. And as I said earlier, land is central to economic development, but it's tied up in this trust status and BIA oversight. I just want to mention that public perception, I often find in my conversations and discussions, encounters around the country, that public perception about tribes and their economic contributions are just not entirely understood. And so I'd like that to be part of our conversation tonight. And if you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask. It's really impossible to understand the economics of Indian country without understanding the history and the law and the lived experience of Indian country. So history really is important because it reveals our political and economic drivers of this policy, but it also reveals the drags and the barriers to economic development. So relationships absolutely matter, and in this space it's really important to be sensitive to sovereignty and to these treaty rights. So we have a mission. We have a very, I'd say, bold mission statement. Our mission is really to support the prosperity of Native nations through actionable research and community collaboration. And oftentimes we think of Native nations, we hear those disparaging demographic numbers, and people want to really focus right there. But there's a lot of prosperity in Indian country. There's a lot of good opportunities for wealth creation and to support well-being. And that's really where we want to enter that space in looking at opportunities for prosperity. We recognize that they're sovereign nations, and we want our research to be very actionable. We have lots of questions. I'm sure you have lots of questions. We can't do all of them. So we want to take those that have the highest value and really make sure that we can turn them into good policy opportunities. And of course, community collaboration is absolutely essential to this work. Our areas of research very broadly are people, land, and capital. Under the people category, we have done some very broad works in education. Our first convening here, in fact, was on early childhood education in Indian country. We really wanted to take a look at the most vulnerable and the most special and the most needing of our youth, and these are the young children. And we know from the research of the Federal Reserve Bank that the return on investment for early childhood education, early childhood development is phenomenal. Every $1 returns about $17. So what does that look like in Indian country? Well, the first place we wanted to take a look at was historical trauma. And that really informed us about the brain development and the needs that our children have for special kinds of instruction. And what we find in Indian country, for example, is that language is so important, that cultural context is so important. These build the protective factors that stay with them, that help them maintain the resiliency through childhood. We've done returns on educations for higher ed. We've realized very significantly that when the Native person goes to college, they indeed earn higher salaries, higher wages, which is what we would expect. But we've also found that those earnings are lower than their non-Indian counterparts. Now, why would that be? It's the type of jobs, the areas and locations of the jobs. Is there something else behind those factors? So we've taken a pretty deep dive, and we are going to be continuing this work as it's part of the bank's overall policy focus as well. When we look at land, it's everything. Everything's connected to land, but here we want to support the best economic use and effective governance of land, and maybe even thinking about an alternative, exploring an alternative status to trust land. Housing and home ownership is really in this space, and we're trying to figure out not only the lending systems, but how do tribes support home ownership from their own institutional governance, and then trying to get out external lenders and federal agencies to work with us to really streamline and normalize lending in Indian country. And that leads us to capital. Everything needs money, right? Lenders are shy or have hesitated or actually have pulled back in financing investments in Indian country. So we want to support the best use of resources for both tribal and private business development, promote entrepreneurship, and include opportunities for affordable financing. This work has really taken us into the native CDFI, community development finance institutions, and the loan funds that are really stepping up and supporting Indian country. So let's get into some research. This is the North American bison. This is one of the ways that we can ask big questions and tackle the law and the history and the policy implications of our work. So the CICD research economist Donna Fair has undertaken an extensive research project to examine the impact of the loss of the North American bison on indigenous economies and the policies that followed. From her research, Donna finds that the near extinction of the North American bison in the late 1800s was arguably one of the largest economic shocks ever recorded in North American history. This is a pile of buffalo skulls. It's a mountain of buffalo skulls. As many as 30 million North American bison existed pre-contact. Native people, indigenous people relied on the bison for everything, for their health, for their tools, for their hunting. It was part and parcel of their lifestyle, their life cycle. So following the rapid slaughter of the bison, less than 1,000 bison remained. This dramatic loss also meant the loss of the livelihoods of the peoples who depended on the bison. Families and communities face serious barriers to economic recovery due to the restrictive federal policies and lack of access to capital. Impacts on Native communities included decreased health and income well over the 20th century. And today, those economies, those communities that lost the bison during the rapid slaughter are among the poorest Native American communities and continue to suffer from increased rates of premature mortality. Moving to something very different, I wanted to show you this slide. It's sort of very elegant in its simplicity, but very deep in its complexity. So this is a slide of the number of HUD, that's a Housing and Urban Development Department, 184 loans by type of land. And we took a snapshot of from 1995 to 2015. And here we see, on the far axis, we see the number of loans, and this is the year. So according to HUD, the 184 Indian Home Loan Guarantee Program is a home mortgage product specifically designed for American Indian and Alaska Native families and tribes and housing departments. Congress established this program in 1992 to facilitate home ownership and increase access to capital in Native American communities. That's all great. And their motto is, Section 184 is synonymous with home ownership in Indian country. But that's not what this chart shows. Our research finds that the HUD 184 loan program has, for the most part, bypassed Indian country. In the past 25 years of the program, it has really failed to create a usable loan program for mortgages on reservations. So you can see, for example, before 2003, where the lines are sort of intersecting, when the loan program was usable only on trust land, mortgage lending was really flat. You didn't see much activity whatsoever. There was not a lot of uptake. Only a few dozen loans were actually made over that period of 10 years. But in 2004, realizing that there was not much action, the program was changed, and tribes were able to designate land outside the reservation. So they would define or designate the county or the entire state as eligible for 184 loans. And then what happened? Mortgage lending certainly took off, but on those fee lands, not on reservation lands, not on trust lands. Excuse me. Now, about 93% of all 184 loans are on fee lands. And this, again, is consistent with our finding that it is very difficult to lend on trust lands, even with a very, very desirable loan product such as the 184 program. This means that most of HUD's $1.4 billion annual budget authority for creating home ownership in Indian country is missing Indian country. It's not reaching Indian country whatsoever. And obviously this is a very dire problem. What if this could be those trust lands? Think about the energy and the synergy and all the community development we could do. with good housing programs on Indian reservations. I want to point out, though, that this graph does show two positive points. One is that there's a demand for home ownership, right? That there are a number, almost reaching 4,000 and beyond, that are looking for, needing, wanting home ownership. That's a good thing. And the other part is that we have ready borrowers, or people ready to become homeowners. The trick is certainly to turn this funding and the demand for housing back to the reservation communities. So when we take a look at what's happening in Indian country with home ownership, we also wanted to take a closer look at the community. We wanted to see what are tribes doing and who, if any, are actually creating these opportunities. And we find a couple. Now the sweet spot is over here in the top right quadrant. We see some tribes that are doing a lot of loans on trust land. That's over on my far right side, but very few in number. Over here we see high in number and a higher percentage on trust land. So we see that the Flathead Reservation, which is home to the Salish and Kootenai tribes, are really out in front, creating home ownership opportunities. And that's followed fairly closely by the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and also Lac du Flambeau. So when we did some case studies and tried to figure out why is this working for Flathead and Oneida and Lac du Flambeau, we find that it's a matter of governance, good governance, that it's a tribal council, tribal leaders in the housing department and in other administrative departments that are supporting home ownership, financial literacy, supporting people really developing and creating assets. So these are the tribes, these are the examples that we really want to follow. Now changing to something very different, I want to show you this slide because this slide shows some really good research by Dick Todd on the workforce in Indian country. And what do you see almost immediately but these two tall lines? And you can't read the bottom. The tallest line is the job segment called Arts, Entertainment, and Recreation. Then we have Accommodation and Food. There's the other category, and the last bar is Public Administration. On the far side, we have agriculture and housing. We have mining and utilities, construction, wholesale trade, retail trade, transportation, so typical jobs. This slide, it shows the research where we compared jobs in 514 nearby counties with 287 reservations. We found some interesting findings. For example, reservations have significantly fewer workplaces per person. Now maybe that's not so unusual given the smaller size perhaps, but this was really alarming or startling or surprising. But we have more jobs per resident on reservations. This is due, we believe, and I think it bears out here, to the high concentration of jobs in the gaming sector. That's the arts, entertainment, and recreation, and the amenity facilities like hotels and restaurants. And certainly tribal government, which was represented, I believe, in the public administration, we see high concentration of workforce. Now we know that there are about 459 tribal government casinos operating in 28 states. It's a very significant part of the revenue, about $32 billion annual revenue. But only 10% of tribal government casinos earn over 80% of that gaming revenue. And there's a very meager uptick, or maybe even a plateauing of gaming revenue. And maybe that reflects that the market is saturated, maybe it reflects that there's competition, online gaming, sports betting, but it's an area to take a look at because we're seeing the plateau or a flattening of gaming revenue, but this is where a high concentration of jobs are. And most of those jobs, I believe, are non-Indian jobs that can support local communities. So what are the implications of these data? Well, certainly I mentioned the spillover effect of reservation economies, and from my experience, there's a lot of spending going on in local communities that really boost the local economies, you know, the goods, the services, all of that support the schools and the infrastructure. That is deriving from reservations. But we have concerns, or I have concerns about diversification, concentrating too much of an economy in one sector. And when we see the possibility of a plateau or even a downtick, we need to think about what else can we do and who should be doing that kind of work. So tribes have generally occupied this field of economic development, and what we try to promote, what we try to encourage is the development of private economy and entrepreneurs to complement that and to alleviate some of that risk. Now, this isn't a very sexy, fun slide, but there's a lot to it. So let me explain. This is an example of research collaboration that we've been doing with the University of St. Catharines right across the river. It shows that in 2017, American Indian women were stopped, searched, and arrested at higher rates than other women in Minneapolis. And there is indeed a strong geographic pattern to these police stops. To get a little bit nerdy, let me tell you a little bit about the numbers. 1.42% of women in Minneapolis report their race as American Indian or Alaska Native. But the Minneapolis police reported that 6.57% of all their stops of women were Native Americans. This is a ratio of 4.63, meaning that American Indian women were stopped by police almost 5 times as often as their proportional share in the city's population. And you certainly can see that the graph shows that higher representation, over-representation of American Indians in the police stops. Now, the official data combine 2 very different types of stops in the suspicious persons category. One type is just as it sounds. It's a real stop of someone the police finds suspicious. The other type, which also appears to be pretty common, is more benign and includes just stopping somebody to talk to that person on the street, maybe providing some assistance to that person. The data do not distinguish between these 2 types of stops, so we really can't tell how much the extra stops for American Indian women are of one kind or the other. I should say, by the way, that the ratio for American Indian men was 2.23. That means that 3.37% of the stops of men were Native Americans, but Native Americans were represented only 1.5% of the male population. So this obviously suggests that American Indian men also were disproportionately stopped, but less so than women. Now, for Black men, their ratio was 2.55. They represented 48.7, almost 50% of all the stops, but represent only 19% of the male population in Minneapolis. So obviously, we see some pretty stark trends here. But of all the races reported by the police, American Indian women were the most disproportionately stopped in Minneapolis. We have shared our findings with the Minneapolis police and the Native community and leaders in the community. Minneapolis police have explained some of the discrepancy, both in terms of its data collection and the coding of the data processes. I think our work has really helped the police department focus on this data issue, and it may get addressed at some point. Until then, I think this finding is a bit clouded with ambiguity, and I do think that the research that's ongoing by St. Catharines will really illuminate a lot more of what's going on. And I should also mention here that we are aware that some of these official stops are actually helpful. And we do not want the research to lead to any sort of knee-jerk anti-police reaction. But it is a startling trend and is something that we want to take a close look at. Here I want to show you some of our research that we've put into dynamic resources available to all of you at a touch of a click. This is what we call our Reservation Profiles. It's an awesome tool, and this just shows a snippet of what we can do with the Reservation Profiles. So exploring key demographic data and economic indicators on many Indian reservations is really just a click away. We have profiles of 77 federally recognized reservations, and those populations have at least 2,500 people. The profiles feature the statistics computed from the U.S. Census American Community Survey from 2010 to 2014. Over here, we see the demographic data of the Flathead Reservation of the Salish and Kootenai tribes. And we can see, for example, on the far right, that's the male dotted line population pyramid, and the right side is the female. We see that the flat is in the blue, the United States is in orange, and all the reservations are in green. So this is a really great tool to compare and contrast. How does our reservation, our community compare? And we can see that there's a pretty good sized bulge around middle age, from about 50 to 65. We also see a growing population, and that's a trend that we're seeing across Indian country, that one of the fastest, if not the fastest, growing population segments in our society. On this side, we just added HMDA mortgage lending data. So not only can you see the socioeconomic demographics, you can now see the lending trends. This also shows by property type. We go a little closer. This is up to 2016. So you can see a big spike in site-built homes. Those are that's on the orange line. And then a dramatic decrease. These are smaller numbers, by the way. But then we're seeing an uptick in manufactured homes. And I didn't add my manufactured housing slide, but I want to just share with you that manufactured housing in Indian country is incredibly popular. About 75% of all home loans from American Indians are for manufactured housing, and sadly about 75% of those applications are denied. We see that manufactured housing is very popular because, one, it's affordable. Two, it's especially if it's a chattel mortgage, not tied to the land, you can get that house situated on your land very, very quickly. Unfortunately, chattel lending, like personal property car loans, really does not increase in value. So as popular and as affordable and as quick as they are, and needed as they are, they're not creating wealth, they're not creating assets and equity in Indian country. And it's something that I would really like to take a close look at, obviously, when we look at adjusting for trust status. Something that we really had a lot of fun with last year was with our Native American financial institutions. And I'm just calling them NAFIs. It's a term that I coined, and now they've become NAFIs. What are NAFIs? There are Native-owned banks, our Native-owned credit unions, and our Native Community Development Finance Institutions, or CDFIs. I wanted to know who is serving Indian country. We often think of non-Indian banks. Well, during the Great Recession, we saw a huge retraction of banks and lenders, both from rural and Indian country. And I really wanted to see who is serving Indian country. And I wanted to start with our Native financial institutions. So we identified and plotted, located the headquarters, and then identified their loan and assets. And so if you go onto our website, take a look at our NAFI map. You can see the asset size, the loan portfolio. You can see the location. Some are really big, some are really small. but every single one of them are providing very critical, necessary capital to Indian country. Over here, this is something that's very near and dear to my heart. It's our Tribal Leaders Handbook on Home Ownership. This is something that was a real collective collaboration last year with our National Native Home Ownership Coalition. One of the working groups was our Tribal Leadership Working Group. And we're talking about leasehold mortgages, we're talking about trust lands, we're talking about secondary markets, we're talking about needs assessment, we're talking about eco-design, energy efficiency homes, manufactured homes, and tribal leaders said, wait a minute, we need a guidebook, a handbook that lays all of this out for us. So we put our heads together and we created this handbook on home ownership. And it really is a comprehensive guide to lending and home ownership that's used by federal agencies and lenders and truly by tribal leaders. We're creating online resources and webinars to actually operationalize and implement the book. And it's also available on our webpage. We really do want to see if we can create new paradigms and shift the conversations to create these opportunities for home ownership and safe and affordable housing in Indian country. A few other collaborations I just want to share with you. One was our Great Plains Tribal Leaders Economic Development Summit a few years ago, led by the president of the Oglala Sioux tribe of the Pine Ridge Reservation. I think we had 35 or more tribes represented, really digging in and trying to understand the tools and opportunities to leverage the resources that they have to catalyze economic development. I've mentioned a little bit about our higher ed work, and we had a convening with tribal colleges, universities, professors, educators, really everything that goes into creating good pipelines for education outcomes for our Native students. Over here is our Healthy Children, Healthy Nations initiative that came out of our early childhood development work. And that's a really beautiful partnership with Better Way Foundation and the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux community. We've just created a funders collective. So we're pooling funds and distributing them out to early childhood development programs in Minnesota. It's a really cool project, a really cool way to create private funding for these great programs. And of course, our coalition. Our coalition now is really focusing on lending systems, as I mentioned earlier, trying to normalize lending, but also to help support home buyer readiness. We want to create the capacity, that financial knowledge and literacy to really take on the responsibilities of home ownership. So what are we going to be doing in the future? Well, in the one hand, the world is our oyster. There's so much to do and so many questions to answer. We don't have a lot of data, and getting data is expensive and time-consuming. So we want to continue the work in partnership to create the vital research necessary to implement effective evidence-based policy and changing these narratives about Indian economies. I'm very hopeful. We have high aspirations, and we have a terrific team. So thanks for being with us, and I think we have some time for questions if you have it.
Somebody just opened my big mouth. You're pretty loud. Yeah. So I had the slide on HUD 184. Oh, we got to turn it on. Okay, and so the slide on the HUD 184 loans, so if there's been that growth, and I can't remember what the statistic was, but 93% are on fee simple land?
93% of the HUD loans are on fee lands.
So all that growth, and then the next slide was the Flathead, Oneida, and Lac du
Yes, these are
Flambeau. So did
tribes
they
that
create all theirs on fee simple land?
No, these are trust lands.
Oh, so
These
that
are
slide is
trust
only
lands.
trust land loans?
Yeah, so this is the percentage of loans on trust lands. So
Okay.
the higher up you go, the more you have loans on trust lands.
Okay.
And this is the volume of loans.
So they've been successful at creating them
They're
on trust
creating
land.
loans, lots of loans.
Lots of loans on trust land.
On trust land, that's
Yeah.
the sweet spot.
So have they partnered with a few banks that are also really active in that? Or?
Very good question.
And that's-
The Salish and Kootenai tribes have their own bank. Yes, this was one of the things that got us very interested in Native American financial institutions. When they started out this work with home ownership, they knew they needed to do two things, or at least two things. They needed an administrative infrastructure to support this. So they undertook establishing their own land title records office. They knew that they needed the records and they needed the ability to do this process very quickly in a very streamlined way. And then they needed access to capital. So they created their own bank, Eagle Bank. And there are other banks in the community, and it's actually a very good competition. And all of the banks actually require all of their borrowers to take home buyer or financial education.
So one little, the follow-up that so they created their own registration system, but then did they bulk them and go to the BIA?
No.
They're independent of the BIA?
They what we call 638 contracted those services from the BIA. This is what we call self-governance. So they assumed those responsibilities from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, so that it's all their own title work, all their own recording work. And I think that's the ultimate model of what we need to see across Indian country, given the right resources and support and tools. Yeah. We've got a couple back here, Nikki, Nancy. Shout out.
I was wondering, as far as, so I see that, okay, thank you. I see that you have some policy in terms of where the Federal Reserve is. I was wondering if you had any sort of congressional legislative priorities that you're looking to build.
We do have a policy focus with our work. We do have a government affairs officer in the bank, and we work closely with her and with congressional staff to both share our research and look at the hot points and opportunities to really ease some of the policy or to clarify the policy or actually to support data collection. So yes, it's sort of multidimensional, both in terms of sharing the information that they need to make good decisions, hoping that they can help us support us with access to data. And then overall, what does this mean for Indian affairs generally?
In trying to stimulate economic development on the reservations, for the last 6 or 7 years, the newspapers have been full of the whining complaints of private sector employers in outstate or rural Minnesota that they can't find workers. And it's supposedly it's particularly difficult for manufacturing companies. But more recently, there have been complaints by the resort industry in Minnesota that they can't find workers, low-skilled, kitchen help, restaurant help, maids, maintenance people, this kind of thing. So it's bad enough that many of these resort operators are trying to get temporary visas to bring in people from Eastern Europe and other low-income areas on a seasonal basis. On the other hand, you've got reservations where the unemployment rate is 60%. So you've got two ships passing in the night. You have people, you have employers in rural areas that say that if they don't get some relief somehow, they're going to go broke or have to move their operations into the Twin Cities. Then you have thousands, maybe 20,000 unemployed American Indians who live in rural Minnesota, and one wonders precisely what's happening here. Is it bias against hiring American Indians? Is it American Indians who don't want to work for white owners? Or, it seems that there are jobs, there are unemployed people. In a perfect world, these people would have come together long ago without government help, but it's not happening. So,
well, I think you've identified a really incredible opportunity. Many tribes have colleges and universities in their community, and these colleges could be turned into vocational training opportunities, both for tribal members, obviously, in the community, but training opportunities for those to support employment opportunities nearby reservations. So yes, it is, when we look at this, it is paradoxical that we have high rates of employment, but remember, not all tribes have casinos. And when we look at these other sectors, we see that they're actually underrepresented in the other typical sectors that we see in county and nearby. So the employment opportunities in rural America is pretty tough. I came from rural development before I was here at the Federal Reserve Bank, and rural America is retooling itself as well. It's a completely different landscape in terms of what their job sectors look like. And so as much as we're trying to figure out what works in Indian country, we also need to look at what is needed in nearby rural communities.
Thank you, Patrice. I want to inquire about a couple of points that you raised in their intersection of those. One, you noted that one of the regulatory components of the Federal Reserve System at writ large is basically has a regulatory oversight function. But also you had the Venn chart on people, places, land, and then also capital.
Yes.
And I just wanted to inquire about, I know it's a relatively complex subject, but about the Community Reinvestment Act is currently under modernization.
Yes.
And that's one of the regulatory components. And just wondering if you were having any success talking with, the three regulators as you're one of the triad there that are in the modernization, but kind of increasing access to capital through that particular component, because this is a really important issue, especially with access to
You're
credit
absolutely
and capital.
right, Lance, and I should have mentioned that earlier. It's something that Michael Grover from our Community Development Department is taking on in a really big way. And I've had conversations with tribal leaders across the country on what is needed to improve and to modernize the CRA, especially in Indian country. Part of that looks at assessment areas, right? What do we define as assessment areas for banks? Many of our banks are using online tools, and we know that one of the things that's really needed in Indian country is access to broadband. So those two things, accessibility, assessment areas, we don't have a brick and mortar building anymore, so how do we define our assessment area? Now, Indian country is I would say a special area that needs special attention. So when we think about what banks need to do in terms of serving the underserved, I think they need to take a look at our map, like our NAFI map, see where the banking deserts are, see who's lending, who's not lending. Look at the denial rates that we're seeing, the high cost of financing as well as the high numbers of denial. So we've had conversations around Indian country. They've had conversations with the OCC. We've had listening sessions. Michael held a listening session in Rapid City. We've gotten some really good comments, a list of recommendations. NAFOA, which is the Native American Finance Officers Association, has posted a list of recommendations for Indian country. And Dante Desiderio, the executive director of NAFOA, has been meeting at very high levels in Washington, D.C. to push that platform. So I thank you for that question, Lance. Yes, sir.
I was just curious if you had any thoughts on when you have a reservation, you have tribal government and tribal council, but it's generally also in a county, in a state. And so you have these different levels and layers of interlocking and conflicting bureaucracies. So I was wondering if you had any examples or thoughts on like what constraints or opportunities those different bureaucracies might present.
Yes, those bureaucracies are jurisdictions, and those jurisdictions have definite power, a power to tax, a power to regulate, the power to impose criminal sanctions. And you're right, it is a maze. And you didn't mention the federal government, so you have many overlaying interspersed jurisdictions and authority. And we call this just sort of a crazy quilt of jurisdiction. It's just not a lot of rhyme or reason. And in Minnesota, it's actually a little bit more different in that we're a Public Law 280 state. And Public Law 280 was a federal law passed in the 1950s during the termination era, the termination of the federal trust responsibility to tribes, whereby the federal government turned over its jurisdiction to the state. So the state of Minnesota has civil and criminal jurisdiction over individual Indians on the reservations in the state of Minnesota, with the exceptions of the Red Lake Nation and the Bois Forte Reservation. The Bois Forte tribe and the state retroceded its jurisdiction back to the federal government. So right there, you have an interspersing of jurisdiction. And it's over individuals, it's not over tribes. So right there, you have an absolute dire need for the local sheriff and the tribal police to connect and say, we are all about public safety. How do we do that in the best, most efficient, cost-effective way? Does that happen? Probably not. Not as often as it should be. Tribes have, in my experience, and I've worked with tribes all over the country. I'm a lawyer and have been in-house counsel, and I've worked with tribes individually all over the country. Tribes have done a lot of really good work around mutual aid agreements, and that would be emergency responders like police, fire, that sort of thing, EMS vehicles, especially if a casino has good equipment and can go out and respond much more quickly and effectively. We have seen really good tax agreements that clarify the state's taxing authority on the reservation and that where they do not have that authority. Those kind of agreements, memorandums of understanding, memorandums of agreements, mutual aid, cross-deputization, these are all really, really important ways that sovereign governments work together to provide cost-effective and efficient public services. And when it works, it's beautiful, it's brilliant. I mean, you have trust, you have respect, but obviously when it doesn't work, the situation can become very dire. Yes, ma'am.
Can I just follow up on that? So every state could be different?
You ask, is every state different? Absolutely, absolutely. Every state is different, absolutely. There are 6 mandatory Public Law 280 states, and some states took only pieces and parts of jurisdiction. But there are, the majority of the states, do not have criminal or civil jurisdiction. But there is a lot of fee land on reservation. Not only do we have the crazy quilt of jurisdiction, we have a crazy quilt of fee land interspersed with trust land, which we call checkerboarding. These are really complicated topics. I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but you point out a real point of exacerbation in Indian country. Yeah. Yes, sir, Mr. Paulson.
I think this is on, right? On?
Yes.
Patrice, you mentioned about the manufactured home versus custom-built homes.
Yes.
You say there was a dramatic drop-off in custom-built homes or manufactured homes?
Well, what I was explaining was the example of the Flathead Reservation. This was an illustration of our reservation profiles, and if you take a look on the home ownership part of the reservation profile, What we see here is that there was a real drop-off on the site-built or stick-built homes. And we see a slight uptick in the manufactured homes. This is just for the Flathead Reservation. But I also mentioned that manufactured homes are very popular options in Indian country.
Is this, can this be kind of taken generally across Indian country, or is every individual reservation quite different?
I would take it reservation by reservation. But overall, what we're looking at, what we're seeing from the HUMDA loan data is that overall American Indians prefer manufactured home loans more than conventional loans.
The other thing that you mentioned was, did you say that manufactured homes don't have the equity buildup as custom-built homes?
Well, that can be the case, especially if it's a personal property or chattel loan. That means that the home is just is not attached to the land. It's sort of a legal fiction because, of course, it's attached to the land. But it's not a mortgage, a real property-based mortgage. If it were attached and affixed and secured by a real property mortgage, then you would also sort of subsume the value of the land. But since it's only a chattel mortgage or personal property like your car, you're not building up that equity. That equity really comes from the land.
So if in a regular home in the city, generally you're figuring that if you are there for 5 or 10 years, your property has increased in value.
That's right.
And that's not the case with these manufactured
Well,
homes?
your property is increasing because you're paying down your loan, right? So you're reducing debt.
But the value of the piece.
value is also increasing because it's attached to the land. So on the reservation, when it's not attached to the land, you may be decreasing your debt, which is a good thing in terms of wealth creation, but you're not getting the value of the land, that equity that comes from increasing the value of the land. Yeah, we have one more question or 2 more questions.
Can I just follow up? So
Oh, sure.
the problem, though, is on trust land, you can't.
Yep. There you go. Right.
All right, so part of the problem with that is on trust land, there's a difficulty with attaching it to the land.
That's right, that's right. We can get leasehold mortgages that are real property mortgages, but that's the 184 chart. That's very difficult, and time is money. You know, when you want to make a loan, need a home, you want to get it done, right? All right, sir, you've got the last question.
I believe that the label Indian country is kind of a fuzzy, warm concept that came out of a liberal think tank in Washington, D.C. The reality, the history is that the Indian tribes throughout North America did not get along well with each other. They traded with each other, but every once in a while they went to war with each other and killed all the men and raped all the women and enslaved all the children. Today, the Indian tribes don't agree with each other on most things, and there are 3 very wealthy tribes in the United States, or in Minnesota, the Mdewakanton Sioux, the Prairie Island, I don't know whether it's Sioux or Dakota Sioux, and the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe, and they're wealthy because of the casino revenue, but the tribes invest in hotels in downtown St. Paul, and they spend $6 or $8 million a year lobbying the Minnesota legislature, but they have a lending capacity of $200 or $300 million, and they're not helping the poor tribes throughout the state. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I guess I totally disagree with you. Yeah. It's certainly true that tribes as nations, like nations across the world, in our very early days, occupying this space, there was certainly their tension between tribes. As far as their disagreements today, I certainly think that there's a lot more in common. I think tribes are much more cohesive, coherent. They've got a very strong message, a very coherent, strong leadership, and they're doing their utmost best to get some traction on economic and community development. And as far as the rich tribes supporting some of the poor communities, First, I want to say that they certainly are, they certainly do. And the three that you've mentioned are some of the most generous benefactors of so many Native and non-Native programs and services. The other thing is that we know that there are very fortunate communities in our state, in our metropolitan area, and they certainly reap the benefit of their good fortune of location. But when we see the opportunities to help each other out, I think Indian country is by far some of the most generous and giving and supportive communities that I have ever seen. So with that, I'd like to say thank you all again for your time, for your attention, for your interest. And I hope we get to do this again in the future. Thank you.